Welcome to the Face-to-Face Ministries podcast. I'm Kathy Little.
And I'm Melinda Wilson, and we are talking all things inner healing, true connection with Jesus, and the full benefits package of the cross. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to episode 28 of the Face-to-Face Ministries podcast.
Yes.
We are so glad that you're here.
Thank you for joining us. And we are so excited about this guest today. We were going to interview him back in February, March, and it just didn't work out. But then we were able to reconnect with him up in Washington State, in Yakima, Washington, where we collected also some interviews with Brian Simmons of the Passion Translation and Danny Silk. So those interviews are coming. But Harold Eberle, the first time I heard this guy speak, he blew my mind. Like paradigms shot out of the water. Like, didn't you feel that way? It's like mind blown.
Yeah.
So crazy. And we met him for the first time through the River Network. Now, the River is something really significant to us. The River Revival Network. We are part of the River. And how are we a part of them? Melinda, why don't you tell them why we're connected to the River?
Well, we've been licensed and ordained with them, and that means we can marry and bury. But what's even more important is that we're part of a family that really provides a covering spiritually, and everyone in the River is kingdom-focused, kingdom-minded, whether they run a church, they're a missionary overseas, they're an evangelist, one of the fivefold, they have their own ministry, or they're a stay-at-home mom, and they just love advancing the kingdom. This is a family. That's what the River really is all about. They have
very relational.
Yeah, they have conferences or gatherings twice a year, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, where all the different River people can come together and just be encouraged and supported. It's really about relationship and friendship.
Yeah, so this is a totally free plug for the River. If you are in ministry and you're looking to connect with like-minded people, understanding the things of the Spirit and advancing the kingdom, and you'd like to be part of that, just go to riverfellowship.net and you can find out more information about that, because it really is a family. And one of our future guests actually recommended we connect with the River, and we have thanked her every day since. It's really been a very positive experience for us. We love the overseers, Rich and Lindy Oliver, and all of the amazing pastors and ministry leaders that we have connected with in the River. So check that out. But I tell you all that to tell you this. We met Harold Eberle at the West Coast River Gathering 2 years ago, and absolutely the content you're going to hear in this week and next week's episode, part 1 and 2 with Harold Eberle, is going to blow your mind. So buckle your seatbelt. Allow yourself to be open-minded and open-handed with some of the paradigms that have been cemented in your brain since you were born, but you don't even know where they came from, because he's going to rattle some of those things. And I think it's a good rattling, because he's going to shake some foundational truths and really bring to life some things in your life that will make a difference. I believe it. It's made a huge impact on me.
Well, I think that we are rattling more and more paradigms, not necessarily intentionally, not trying to be provocative, but I think that if we want to grow and mature as believers, as sons and daughters in our identity, that we have to be willing to look at the lenses through which we've seen God all of our life and really hold them up to truth and light, and see if there's any things on there that maybe are warped views because of our own experiences. So I would encourage you to listen and just see what the Holy Spirit tells you through Harold Eberle.
Yep, so here we go, introducing you now to Mr. Harold Eberle. I'm so excited to have a chance to talk to you. There were some things that came up in this conference when we were, I think it was like a year or two ago, and you said some things there that just blew my mind, and we were really excited to have you share those things with our listeners. But first of all, some people may not know who Harold Eberle is, and so I would love for you to introduce yourself, share a little bit about your ministry, maybe about some of your books, because you're a prolific author as well. So I'm just going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great. So I've been married to my wife for 40 years. So it's a long time. We got 3 grown-up children. We live in Yakima, Washington, USA. And we've spent the 40 years traveling, especially the last 35 years. We hit a lot of nations, ministering, telling people about God, building schools. We've got quite a few schools that we've been able to build around various difficult countries, difficult places around the world. Right now we're working a lot in Pakistan, going next to Indonesia. And we've been doing it together all these years. We love it. I do a lot of writing. Last book was directed toward young people before they go to university. Because, right now, about 80% of our young people who believe in God, they go into the university, going to church. They will come out the other end 4 years later, no longer believing in God.
Wow.
So I wrote a book hoping to prepare our young people so when they go to university, they don't lose their faith. So that's what I just finished doing a book at, but we've done a lot of other books. And we love to encourage Christians in their walk with God and help to reveal who God is.
That's a great segue, to reveal who God is.
Yes.
Because that was one of the things that caught my attention so profoundly. Having grown up in the church, had certain perceptions of God, perspectives of God, who He is. And you can go through your whole life and believe what you believe and not know where that belief came from.
Yes.
But you actually have some insight on that. And our ministry is all about helping people connect face-to-face with Jesus. And it is my perception and my own experience that if you don't know who He is and you don't understand His heart, you don't really want relationship with Him, or you don't understand the value of relationship. So, Harold, I would love to just turn you loose. Hoo-ah.
Yes.
Turn you loose to talk about why do we in Western culture believe the way we do about God? Where did those filters come from? And take a cement smasher to that. I mean, take a bulldozer to that, because we want those filters to be gone away with. So I'm going to let you go for it.
Interrupt me whenever you like to, okay? So that is one of my passions. Because we travel to all these other nations, we have to understand their cultures. And what we have discovered is that many people of a different culture read the same Bible we read, but they come up with different understandings. And until you are confronted with another culture, you can't question your own culture. You can't even see until you're really challenged to see that other people do think differently than you. And so through the years, been over 35 years, especially, we hit a lot of countries. Our busiest year, we are in 22 countries, but we are normally in over a dozen countries every year, and we get to know the people. It's what we do, and we try to communicate about God. So coming from that perspective, we spend a lot of time trying to understand how people think about God. Where did they get their perceptions? And I love history. I spend a lot of time every day studying. It's my passion. So I have come to conclude that Christianity in the Western world is formed by some misconceptions. There's some assumptions at the foundation of Western thought. And my passion is, what would Christianity look like if it was separated from Western culture? If we could really tear the two apart? Because people in the Western world don't know where their Christianity starts and where their culture ends. It's so mixed. We look through the Western lens at God, trying to understand God, that we have a mixture today. So one of our strongest passions is to separate the two. I believe that most people who have actually rejected God have rejected the wrong image of God. They haven't rejected the true God.
Right.
They've actually rejected, and sometimes for good reason, the God that was taught to them, because a wrong concept of God. Now, I do believe that the most accurate concept of God is the person of Jesus Christ. Okay, I believe the Bible's inspired, so we can read the whole Bible, and yet the Bible itself teaches us that Jesus came to reveal to us who God is. Jesus' words said, "I came from above to reveal to you the Father." And that is the greatest revelation, to understand that God is a loving Father. And many people don't have that concept of a loving Father. Some of them never had a natural father to even relate to. Others have been taught a God who's a mean judge rather than a loving Father. And sometimes there's a mixture of their concepts of God. And because of the mixture, they've rejected a concept of God that's been pushed on them wrongly. If they knew the true God, they would fall in love with him.
Yes.
So a lot of our work is helping people understand who is the real God. And one of the illustrations Jesus gave, he was trying to talk to the Jewish religious leaders 2,000 years ago, and he explained in a parable saying that there was a father whose son wanted his inheritance before he was of age to get his inheritance. He took the inheritance, ran off, and squandered the money on just terrible living. And then he came back to his father, and he was ready to humble himself to his father. And the father welcomed his son back with open arms, saying, I'm so glad you're back. Didn't punish him, but accepted him fully back. And Jesus was explaining that parable to help people realize this is who God is. God is not a judge who would only accept the son back on certain grounds. I'll only accept this wandering son, prodigal son, if he corrects his behavior, if he apologizes, if he goes through certain routines. Jesus was saying, no, God's not like that. He's like a loving father whose heart passion is to welcome his children home. And so Jesus often was teaching about this subject. Who is God? What is he like? And much of our concept of God is confused. It's mixed in because of people throughout history who've tried to put their slant on what they conceived of God. And Jesus boldly said, I alone have come from above. I alone have come from the Father. No man other than me can convey him to you. He says, you've got to trust my image, because that's why God sent Jesus into the world, to reveal to us who God is. And then even to make it clearer, we're told that Jesus is the exact representation of the Father.
Yes.
So if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. So that changes a lot of things. Many people conceive of God as somebody who's about to strike them with lightning, judge them, condemn them, that anger is coming out of God. Okay, well, wait a minute. Jesus is the exact expression of who God is. He didn't go around condemning people, judging them, striking them, smiting them. Jesus didn't do any of that. He went around healing people, loving people, forgiving people, telling them that God forgives them. That's the perfect image. Jesus is the perfect revelation of who God is. So that's the starting point. Now, we can get some indications of who God is by reading the Old Testament. So the part of the Bible before Jesus came is called the Old Testament, of course. And then the New Testament is when Jesus came and after. The Old Testament, though, we only get glimmers of who God is. We get little snapshots. But God in the Old Testament is concealed. In the New Testament, he's revealed. In Jesus, he's revealed. In the Old Testament, we get some descriptions of him doing some scary things, like judging people, and that creates in the reader some fear, and they're wondering, is the God of the Old Testament the same as the God of the New Testament? Because the God Jesus talked about seemed a whole lot nicer. So people like me believe the whole Bible, that God is giving it to us, so we have to reconcile the old and the new. So I start looking more carefully. For example, the most profound revelation of God in the Old Testament was to Moses when Moses went on Mount Sinai and God would come down and reveal himself on the mountain. And the way it's described in the Bible, it's in Exodus 19, that God would come down and the mountain would quake and fear and trembling and fire. And it was just terrifying to everybody. And they were told, God told Moses, don't let the people come up. They must stay at the bottom of the mountain or they'll be struck with fear. And then God told Moses, come on up to the mountaintop. Moses went to the mountaintop and cried out to God for 40 days and 40 nights. God, show me who you are. Show me who you are. After 40 days of fasting and crying out to God, God said, okay, I'll show you who I am. But what you will see is my goodness. You know what he got to see? God didn't reveal how angry he is or anything like that. He says, you want to see who I really am? And God said, I'll show you my goodness. And then he explained that my goodness is so great, I'm going to have to hide you in a rock. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of a cliff. So, because if my goodness were fully exposed to you, it would destroy you. So I'm going to have to hide you and protect you, because otherwise my goodness would just so overwhelm you, you couldn't tolerate it. You'd blow up. So God says, to show you who I really am, I'm going to show you my goodness. And God says, all I can do is show you my back and hide you in the rock, because that's how good I really am. You see, Moses got to go inside to see who God really is. The rest of the people stayed at the bottom of the mountain. They were looking at a cloud. They could not see who God really is. And today, there's a whole lot of people who stay outside at the bottom of the mountain, and they're looking at God from a distance, and they're afraid of him. They've not gone right to him like Moses did. They stay at the bottom of the mountain only thinking God is that terrifying thing, rather than boldly going through and finding out that God is good. He's a loving Father, like Moses discovered. So we get a glimpse of God. And again, in the part of the Bible before Jesus came, there's only these glimpses of the true God. We don't get the full expression until the New Testament. And it's interesting, in the New Testament, there's a writer named Paul, and he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 that people who read the Old Testament have a veil over their eyes. That if you and I try to develop our image of God just by reading the Old Testament, we're only getting a clouded view. And then he explained that when we come to Jesus, the veil is taken away and we can see the true God. Paul was explaining in 2 Corinthians 3 that when people turn to Jesus, the veil is taken away, then they can see clearly who God is. See, if they only read the Old Testament, they'll have a veiled image of God. They're still at the bottom of the mountain. They've not gone through the cloud. But now that Jesus has came, we can get a clear image. What? By looking at Jesus. Jesus walked around loving people, forgiving them, talking to the children, going after sinners. And Jesus was teaching people, saying, this is what God's like. He pursues sinners. He doesn't run away from sinners or isolate himself. People think God is so judgmental. He is so holy, sinners can't come near him. That's a misunderstanding of holiness. The definition of holiness, how are we going to find that? Some people think holiness is to separate yourself from that which is sinful. No, the perfect picture of holiness is Jesus Christ. You can't separate holiness from love. Jesus went after sinners. He hung around them. There's nothing in God's nature that makes him run away from sinful people. He's the hound dog of heaven. He goes after people, pursuing them because he's a loving Father. Way back in the beginning of the Bible, Adam and Eve sinned. And when they sinned, we see God came after them. The problem in the relationship between God and Adam and Eve was not on God's side. It was Adam and Eve who went and hid. God continued pursuing them. God's pursuing every person listening to us right now. He's pursuing them. He's after them. But we are the ones who turn away from him. The separation is on our side, not his side. In fact, it says in Paul's writings in Acts chapter 17 that God is very close to every human being. Every human being. It says God lets the sun shine on the good and the evil. God is trying to reveal his love to every human being. So back to the Old Testament, there's a veiled image of God. You can't get the real image of God. But when you come to Jesus, that veil is taken away. But some people, they actually have elevated the Old Testament up and said, that's the God of the Bible. No, those glimmers are different. But we're also getting a misconception of that God, because there are certain things in our Western culture that we filter. Like in the Old Testament, God's called a judge. Well, as a Western person, we have a concept of a judge being someone who sits in a courtroom and criminals come before him one after the other, and the judge is sitting there saying you're guilty or innocent, and then for the guilty imposing a penalty. That's the Western concept of a judge. So when we hear God's a judge, we're thinking, there's somebody who's finding fault, who's saying criminals are guilty and imposing penalty. That's our association in the Western world. In reality, that's not what the word judge means. In Bible times, the word judge had nothing to do with the Western understanding of judge. To understand what judge is, you have to go back to the book of Judges. In the Old Testament, there's a book called the Book of Judges. That'd be the best place to find out the definition of judge, the book of Judges.
Sure.
Every one of those judges, what they did is they watched over the people, and when oppressors came, when the neighboring countries came to attack God's people, to put bondages on them, to take away and steal from them, a judge would rise up and deliver the people, set the oppressed free. The definition of the word judge in Bible times was not a modern day judge in the Western world. Often the word judge is translated as a deliverer. No, what a judge was is somebody who sees oppression, comes on the scene, and delivers people, sets them free. God's a judge, yes, but not a Western judge. He's a biblical kind of judge who delivers. That's his goal. Jesus said, I came to deliver, to set free. I didn't come to condemn. You've got the wrong image.
Wow.
So that makes a huge difference in how we understand the Old Testament.
Absolutely. My goodness. Because
Like,
that's what I grew up with
changes.
that. Yeah.
Yes, me
I grew
too.
up with that. He's the judge on the waiting to throw the gavel against me.
You're guilty.
Yeah, that's totally. And I bet a lot of our listeners feel that way too.
Exactly.
But that's not an accurate perception.
It's not.
It's not what the Bible meant.
No.
I love this. Keep
That's
going.
filtering through the Western world
That's
view.
awesome. Yeah.
So
that's a game changer.
It's
right
a game
there.
changer. For example, like in the Old Testament, Sodom and Gomorrah is a report of two cities that were very sinful. And we as Western people read that and we think God's very angry at those cities. We're thinking this judge saying you're guilty and now you'll be punished. No, that's a Western understanding. If you now go to the understanding of the people of the Bible days, it doesn't say God was angry. No, God is a deliverer. He had to remove Sodom and Gomorrah, remove the sinfulness of those two cities, lest it destroy and spread to the rest of humanity. That God was grieved in his heart what was happening, so he had to stop it. A deliverer is someone who comes on the scene, a hero, a champion, to set people free, to remove the cancer, remove the negativity, so he can save people.
Would that be the same as what happened with Noah?
Exactly.
All
yes.
right.
So
Okay.
let's look at that story through two different eyes.
Okay.
Noah's flood. If we are a Western person, we read that and we think God is angry at everybody in the world, and now he's going to call them guilty and set a punishment. That's not what the Bible says. It doesn't say he was angry. It says he was grieved. God looked down at the world and said, it's so bad, I have to start over with Noah. I have to wipe the world clean and start over for humanity's sake. It had gotten that bad. It doesn't say he was angry. It says he was grieved in his heart. He didn't want to do it. It's not his plan. It broke his heart. Deliverer says, I have to now wipe the slate clean so I can start over and start humanity again. That changes
Wow.
what you see in God's heart. In fact, you have to apply it to every example in the Old Testament where we see God acting a certain way. But we couldn't even come to this understanding unless we had had Jesus, because Jesus is the standard of who God is. I want to know who God is. I look at Jesus. Jesus says, I alone have been with the Father. I alone have come from above to tell you who he is. No one else has the true revelation. So again, you want to know who God is? We look at Jesus. He's a pretty good guy.
Yeah.
God's a good person.
Yes.
So just like Moses had to go through the cloud and then he gets to see God's goodness, we have to go through the cloud. You can't stay outside and know who God is. If you come through the cloud and come into the presence of God, you will be overwhelmed by his goodness. It's the goodness that conquers us. It's his love. In fact, that is the revelation that comes out of the New Testament, that God is love. The very consistency of his nature is love, love, love.
Yes.
Flowing out of him.
Yes, and he can't operate outside of that because it's who he is.
It's who he is. It's
just
his
who he
stuff.
is.
Yes.
Wow.
That's huge.
It is huge because
Yes.
so many people, myself included, I mean,
Yes.
seriously, I had decades of misperceptions about who God is. I read this book. I can't even remember the author. The title of it was The Deity Formerly Known as God.
Oh.
And it addressed chapter by chapter how we think God is the judge with the gavel, or he's the talent show judge wanting us to perform for favor and wanting us to perform for approval and all of that kind of thing. And, or the genie that we, okay, well, he's going to provide this or that.
Yeah.
But it is such a skewed perception. If you dial it back to the simplicity of who Jesus is, how he walked the earth, and he says, I'm the exact representation of the Father.
Yes.
Now, I have to say, there's still a lot of the Old Testament that doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are ways of interpreting that that don't make sense. But when you look at, I always thought that in the days of Noah, God was just mad at everybody. And it's like, that's that. No, but it does say he was grieved. And with Sodom and Gomorrah, the same thing. It grieved him as a father. So many people do not understand the relational aspect of God and his pursuit of relationship with us from the get-go.
Exactly.
And I know you've got stuff to say on that, because that was his whole business for being here was relationship. That's why he made us.
Yes, that's why he made us. This whole thing of God does seem angry in some spots in the Old Testament, but we can't see his anger as his nature. His nature is love. Therefore, everything has to be a subset of his love. Like, we can imagine a mother defending her children, and she could even be a mama bear defending her children.
Sure.
But her anger is coming out of love for her children. That's where God's anger would come. God is love, and yet love manifests in different ways. And in his God's zeal of his love for his people, he would defend them. There's things that can come out, and we can see it. It's a description of it in the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 12. It explains the contrast between the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, the Old Testament, and the revelation of God on Mount Zion. And that's an analogy about Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament, God appears on Mount Sinai. It's scary, it's terrifying. And it's explained there in Hebrews that you and I, we don't approach God through Mount Sinai. That's the mountain where God was revealed as scary. That's not where we go to. Instead, we go to the Mount Zion, which is through Jesus Christ. And the God that we encounter through Jesus Christ is a God of love and covenant keeper and promise keeper, one who welcomes us into his presence, one we don't have to be afraid of. And I kind of go back to that bear image, a grizzly bear. So my background was in wildlife. My first degree was in wildlife management. I was a biologist. And if you meet a grizzly bear out in the wilderness and it roars, it's a scary thing, especially if it has a cub. It is just terrifying. Okay? Well, God can be terrifying, but instead of seeing yourself as a stranger approaching a grizzly bear, put yourself in the place of a cub bear looking up at mama bear.
Wow.
From that perspective, the cub bear looks at mama and says, she takes care of me. She's nice. She's soft.
Wow.
Nothing would stop mama from protecting me. So it's the same bear, but it's approached as a stranger or as a cub.
Man.
It just changes things.
It changes everything.
And that's what Hebrews was explaining in chapter 13. We don't approach God through Mount Sinai like Moses did. We approach him through Jesus Christ as children instead of as slaves who have to obey his laws. We come as children saying, hi, Father. Hi, Daddy.
Wow.
It's a different concept of who.
It's completely different, and that's why it was so important to talk to you and have your voice in this podcast series, because this is a game changer.
It is.
Because even as much as we talk about helping people connect face to face with Jesus and get inner healing and all of that, if you're afraid of him and you don't understand who he truly is, that's a whole dynamic of not being able to really approach him. And this whole thing is why we can come boldly before the throne, because we're coming as children, not as outsiders or whatever. And what a beautiful picture of the bear. Because I've seen mama bears with their cubs, and they're very protective, but those babies are safe and they're totally not a care in the world because mama's on duty.
They'll run to mama. Anything
that's
scares
wonderful.
them.
I love the illustration of the mama bear and the cubs.
Oh man, so
and
powerful.
approaching God as, instead of being the one being attacked, or where we've had this view of God being mean or pouring out his wrath, actually being on the other side. Of course, a mama bear is going to have some anger if someone's attacking her babies, just like a human mom would. We, like he said, we've used that statement of, oh, like my mama bear came out when someone was trying to touch my kids. Well, of course. Mm-hmm. And so if we can see ourselves from that perspective, instead of seeing ourselves as the enemy of this bear, seeing ourselves instead as being the one who's being protected by this mama bear, it really does. It's just a little bit of a focus shift, but it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I thought that was so powerful when I first heard him say that. I was like, oh my gosh, that's true. Because we tend to have a perspective on things that is kind of like a default, like patterns that we just kind of have always thought this way, or this is the way we've always heard it. But to have somebody show you a different frame for how you think about God, and just that whole issue of understanding that even when you see these things in the Old Testament that are very confusing, and you see this glimpse, like you get glimpses of God's true heart, but then you see things like Sodom and Gomorrah and Noah. But if you look at the fact that God was grieved and not just mad,
right?
He was grieved. It really does shift the whole paradigm. It really does. And then that whole issue of understanding what judges really were, because I mentioned this in the podcast. I read this book, The Deity Formerly Known as God, and how there are different ways that we view God. And the judge with the gavel getting ready to be thrown, that is how I grew up. That was my whole reality of God, was understanding he was waiting to punish me. And that was just amazing to see that different perspective, that the judge, according to the Bible, the biblical judges, came to make things right and deliver, not to condemn.
Yeah, the deliverer picture. If we can get a picture of a deliverer instead of, when I hear judge, I think of not only, Judge Judy or someone like that, but more of the British judges with the white wig, and it's, it's very formal and pomp and circumstance and traditional, and they usually have a scowl on their face, and they're just waiting to pass down a sentence. And, the plaintiff, the person waiting to hear the sentence, is usually shaking in their boots, like, is it going to be 5 years, 10 years, or just community service? And so when we look at it as a deliverer, the judge really is kind of taking off his white wig and the robe and coming to save. Yeah. And just thinking of this now, but kind of turning the robe into a cape, like a superhero cape, because my mind thinks in pictures all the time. Great. The robe becomes a cape, and now I'm here to save you and not judge you in the same sense of the word that you have thought judge is.
Yeah. That is really a paradigm shift. And, I remember when I first really zeroed in on that verse in Hebrews that says that Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. That has been a paradigm shift for me over the past maybe 15 years or so, maybe 20, because I did grow up in that environment where I had that specific view of God, and it was all, the judge with the gavel and all that. But then if you look at Jesus, who by his own words came to reveal the Father. That's what he said. I'm here to reveal the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. In the beginning, the Word was with God, was God. How can we not believe him when he says, if you want to see God's true heart, his true nature, look at me? And that's not like to just be, the trendy thing. Well, what would Jesus do? But yeah.
Well, but there, like, I don't remember you or him even said it. There are still mysteries that we look at in the Old Testament and think, and I because I've wrestled with this too. It looks like two separate gods.
Yeah,
and
like he's
are
schizophrenic
you Jekyll
or
and
something.
Hyde? And yeah, so why are you seemingly pouring out your wrath and kill the babies or whatever? Smash them against the rock. Really, there's some very poetic language in a lot of the Old Testament. books. Now, of course, we're looking at them through our Western lens, and we don't really understand. We have to look at it in the context of the scriptures. But I have struggled through reading some of the Old Testament books of going, my God, what kind of God is he? So having to also be okay with some mystery and not trying to grasp the entirety of who God is with our finite minds. That's just impossible. So believing the truth of who Jesus says he is, believing the truth of who Jesus says God is paramount. I mean, really, we walk by faith, not by sight. This Christian life is a walk of faith, ultimately. And then we also get to experience him, but we'll never really experience the fullness of who God is on this side of heaven.
Well, even with Moses asking God, show me your face, show me your glory. And what did God do? He said, hey, I'm going to cover you here in the rock. And what did he say? I'm going to show you where my goodness has passed. It wasn't his anger. It wasn't wrath. It wasn't some monster.
He was asking to see.
He said,
God.
Moses said, I want to see you. And God said, okay, here's my goodness. It is so overwhelming and magnificent, you cannot handle it. So I'm going to protect you here while I pass by, and you'll get to see where I was. I mean, that's pretty profound. That Moses, who was given the law, the 10 Commandments, which, I mean, the whole of the Bible, I think there's a lot of Western mindsets, a lot of cultural differences, a lot of things that we don't understand, and a lot of things that we may take up out of a context historically, the contextual historical hermeneutic or the way of looking at the scripture. And I know, we've had exposure to some classes in schooling that have really helped us to broaden our view and get to a place where we can see things a little bit more holistically in the whole story of the Bible, because it has always been about God pursuing man. It has never been about man trying to find his way to God. That's what makes Christianity different than any other religion on the planet, because every other religion is about, how can I get to God? How can I attain this? How can I get there? But Christianity is all about Jesus coming to us. This Jesus is the only way. God chose to come to us through Jesus, and it wasn't about us having to find our way to him. That's a beautiful thing.
So thank you for listening. We really appreciate your being with us.
Yes,
and
we
would strongly encourage you to share the podcast link with your friends and family, and check us out on Instagram, Face to Face Men. And if you have any questions for us, you can contact us through our website, facetofaceministries.org. That's all one word with a 2 spelled out, T-O, not a number. Like us on Facebook. And please subscribe so that you are up to date on the latest podcast. Give us a 5-star rating. Actually, if you're having trouble with that, you can check out.
Yeah, we were realizing that there are a lot of people who want to rate and subscribe and review us, and they don't know how to do it. And I'm really sorry about that. I don't want to just take that for granted. I didn't realize it's not as easy as it sounds. But we are putting some information on our website. By the time this airs, it should be there with step-by-step instructions on how you can review and rate us through Apple Podcasts. So we are going to provide that information to you and try to make it really simple and easy. The other thing that we are doing is we have set up a way for you to very practically and very simply support and become a patron of our podcast. We are doing that through a website called Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/face2face ministries, all spelled out, no spaces, T-O. Patreon is spelled Patreon. This is a way for you to sow into the making of the podcast. And you're not just sowing into the podcast itself, but into the interviews that we are doing, into our travel to get to them, into the editing and the post-production work that we do, which is a lot of hours. I don't think people realize that making a podcast isn't just a simple hit record and go. There's a lot of post-production editing that happens, and we are doing a lot of traveling. So this is a way for you to sponsor and be a patron of what we're doing. be a patron of the art of podcasting making. And there's actually some free gifts on there for our patrons, and you can become a patron at different levels, and you can read about those at patreon.com/face-to-face ministries. And we've got some free stuff there for you, and there's an extra bonus if you sign up as a patron before the end of September, so September 30th. So we would love for you to check that out. It'd be really amazing to have you guys on board. And there's actually some talk going on for our patrons that are on there that we may actually be releasing some content before to the general public, which would be kind of cool because we do try to get these out and posted and scheduled to go out. But we would be able to release those to our patrons on Patreon before anybody else gets it. So if that's enticing to you, that would be really great. So check that out.
Thank you for listening. See you later.
We'll see you next week with Harold Eberle Part 2. Don't miss it.
Be there, be square.